that we have all of our levels done, let's learn how we can create a custom GUI for our entire project. Now, a GUI, or graphic user interface, is the way that people interact with the games themselves. This is things like our health bar, our main menu, all this sorts of things. And without a GUI of some sort, we'd all still be using console commands for everything that we wanted to do with our project. Now, there are entire college degrees all about the process UI and user interface, so I obviously can't dive into all of the subjects having to do with it. However, I should be able to give you an overview to understand a little bit more about how Unity's UI works and how it can be interfaced with the UFPS system. Over the course of this section, we're going to first look at creating a main menu, and that's going to expose you to things like the texts, like the text property, like buttons, and making buttons actually do stuff. And then afterwards, we're going to learn how to replace the default UFPS HUD with one of our own creation. To get started, we're going to start by creating a main menu. Now, a main menu is something that we're going to see a lot of when we're starting a game, right? People don't just jump into the game proper when they buy a title or they install a game on Steam. They have a menu, be able to start the game, to quit the game, that says the title of the game, all that sorts of stuff, and get you hyped up for the actual experience itself. And so that's what we're going to start off while we're creating this video. Over the course of this video, we're going to be introduced to Unity's UI system, adding a text object to our scene, as well as learning what a canvas and an event system is. We'll learn how Rect transforms are different than regular transforms, and how the text component can be used to position text on our screen with different fonts and other properties. We'll learn about how we can make use of anchors and pivots to manipulate our player in the scene. We'll learn about the buttons and button components that exist inside of Unity and how we can use them. We'll learn about how we can use layout groups to dynamically change how our game looks whenever we make modifications to the buttons on the screen. We'll learn how to use onclick events to execute things with our buttons. And we'll learn about how we use build settings to make it so we can load one level to another. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is actually create a new level to hold our main menu. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and go to File, New Scene. And so now we're in a blank level that just has a main camera and a directional light. And oftentimes in main menus, you want to display the characters of some particle systems or something like that. In our case, let's keep it simple and focus on the UI. But one thing I want to do ahead of time is modify the background color in our game. And that's thankfully something that's really easy to do. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and from the hierarchy window, go to main camera, and you'll see that there's a section called clear flags. And that's basically if there's nothing in the world, what do we draw? I say a solid color, and then I can change the color to whatever I want. In my case, I'm going to say a black. And so now if I were to play the game, it would just show black everywhere. That's good. And we're going to create some UI elements to be drawn on top of that. But I just want to clear everything up to make it easy to see. Now in our case, the first UI object I want to talk about is the canvas, which you can create by going to Game Object, UI, and select Canvas. And all those other objects are UI objects, user interface objects, but the canvas is the most important one. And if I double click here, you'll see that this is a really large object. It's taking up the entirety space of our screen, and it's the same shape as the game's current aspect ratio. And it'll be a little hard to see things like this because it's in a 3D mode. So in the Scene tab, I hit that 2D button, and that brings me into 2D mode, which makes the camera isometric. It makes it really easy for me to be able to move around and manipulate. The mouse wheel moves around. You can right-click and drag to move things around. Arrow keys will also move you, and the double-clicking to zoom in works perfectly fine as well. And we'll discuss more about this later on, but just realize that a canvas is a container for other UI elements. And so those white lines dictate the edges of the screen in this particular game. You'll also notice that there is another object that was created for us automatically, which is called the event system. And the event system contains information on how UI elements will interact with each other, such as what object is currently selected, what button's selected, how do you transition to different buttons, all that kind of stuff. But what we care about right now is just the idea that the canvas itself holds the other UI elements. And so to create our first UI element, I'm going to go ahead and right-click on my canvas object, and we're going to say to create a text object. So I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to select UI, and then from there, I'm going to select text, and that's a child. And you can see that it shows up in the Scene tab right here. And if the text object was not a child of the canvas, it would not show up at all. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that unlike other objects, instead of having a transform component, this object has a Rect transform component. Rect stands for rectangle. And instead of just dictating a single position, a single point in space, this dictates pivot, which is where objects will be modified from. Anchors is if the screen size changes, what is the reference point that this object is going to move by. This also contains the XYZ position as well as a width and a height. Now the text component has information about what is being drawn here. So I could change the text here to display our game's name, and you should see that it updates the text inside of the Scene tab. So I'm just going to call it game title right now. You can call it whatever you want. And then I'm going to change my X, Y, and Z positions to move this position around. And like I mentioned before, there's a lot of new properties, a lot of new details to work with. But the first thing I want to do here is I want to center my text object. And you'll notice that the text component does have alignment property, very similar to what you've worked with in Word. So I'm centering it vertically as well as horizontally, and you'll see that now it's currently in the very center of my actual object. And that's great. And if you look at the Game tab, you'll see that it is positioned there. And I can modify the color as well, and it's white. We can see it now. It's very easy for us to read. And the next thing that we're going to want to do is actually increase the size of this text, because it's actually quite small. And we can use the font size property to adjust this. So I can go ahead and select here and drag up, but oh look, as I get too large, it disappears from the screen. And that's because of the height and the width property in the Rect transform. There it dictates the size of this object. And you'll notice that size that's surrounded by those blue dots here. Now if we go ahead and change the width to a higher value, let's say 350, and make the height higher as well, like say 60, you'll see that it shows up much better than what was there previously. And so the larger size will still show. So again with that, another thing we might want to do is change the default font. UFPS comes with a font already called Aldrich Regular, and we can just select that, and there. It looks a whole lot better already. It's got a nice little sci-fi thing going on here. And we can also change the title as well if we want to fit whatever we want the game is. And our game is an awesome FPS game, so I'm going to go ahead and name it Awesome FPS Game. Now this is a good start, but I don't want the text to be directly at the top. I want it to be up on the topper section of my game. So we're going to use the anchors menu to do that. Now anchors dictate where objects will be positioned relative to the screen. So if I were to set this in the max to a 0.75, that would indicate that we want to have this located 75% up the top of the screen in the Y position. Anchors are really convenient because objects that have these anchors set up will move to the same relative position in space even if the resolution is different. And we can actually check this out if we go inside the Game tab, and we can change to different aspect ratios and see how things change. So for instance, 5:4, 4:3, 16:9. Notice that the Y position is all set correctly, and the X as well. It's centered in the X-axis, and it's up 75% on the Y. And so that's great. Depending on the anchor's property, the Rect transform will change the properties to how the objects will be drawn. Right now it's pose X and pose Y, but later on we can see it can be left, right, top, down, and other assorted things. Now the 0 here means that it's 0 pixels away from 75%. So now that we have this, we've created the simplest kind of UI element there is. But next we're going to actually create something a little more complicated. We want to have our main menu have a start button and an end button, but I want to have some kind of container that's going to hold both of those text objects. So it'll be easy for us to add new objects should we wish to. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a panel object. And we can do that by going over to the canvas object within our scene here. And I will go and right click on it and select UI and then select panel. Now notice this panel has anchors set from 0, 0 to 1, 1, and it's taking up the entirety of the screen. And you'll notice that instead of pose Y and so on and so forth, it's now left, right, top, down, so on and so forth. Now, in our case, this also has an image component on it, which draws a particular image, and it scales that image to fit this area. And we'll modify that later on. We'll fix that, the size of it. But what I want to do next is I want to have a button that's going to be part of this panel. So I'm going to right click on my canvas here, select UI, and then select button. And you'll see that there's now a button here that's been created on the center of my screen. And it has an image component, which is that button itself, but there's also a child text object, which is located there, and that's what has that text button. And this also has another component called the button component, which is what actually allows us to touch with. Now, I want to point out that this button gets drawn in the same order of the objects in the canvas. So the thing that's at the top gets drawn first, and so on and so forth. So this button right now is being drawn below the panel. So if I move the button back, it will be drawn on top of the panel itself. And that's something to keep in mind of when dealing with UI elements. So I'm going to go ahead and change the text on this button to instead say Start Game. Likewise, I'm also going to want to have another button for quitting the game, so I'm going to change the name here to be Start Game Button, so it clearly defines what it is. And so I'm going to drag and drop this on the panel and make this object a child of the panel itself. And the reason that we want to do that is because we want to duplicate it one more time, and we will change this object's name to be Quit Game instead. So I'm going to go ahead and change inside here. We can use the translate tool to move this down a little bit. Notice that pose Y right now is set to -52. That means it is 52 pixels down from where it is before. Again, I changed it to quit button instead, and we changed the text to say quit button. And great, that's a good start here. But like I mentioned before, we want to position objects in a way that they will automatically be easy to add new buttons as time goes on. And we can make use of layout elements to fix that for us. And so if I go to my panel here, I can go down to the Add Component section, or we can go to Component and select Layout, and you'll see that there's a number of different options here. I'm going to go ahead and select Grid Layout Group and see what happens. Now notice that all of the children of this class are now being positioned and change the size of them by this layout group component. The cell size is currently set to 100, 100, so the boxes here are 100 by 100. There's also what corner do we start on from, how they are aligned, all that sorts of stuff. And this makes it really easy for us to add new things because it will just position things accordingly. So I'm going to make the buttons a little bigger by setting the cell size in the X to 125, the Y to 35, and right now they're very close, so we might want to change the spacing between each of these particular elements. We also might want to change where they're positioned, but for the spacing, I could change it to 20, and notice that there's now 20 pixels between each of these objects. Now in our case, there's no other things in the y-axis, but this is just in case we want to have new elements get created in the future. Now I want to position these buttons in the center of the world, so I'm going to change the child alignment to middle center. And now you'll notice that all these objects are located here. And then I don't necessarily need this panel to fill the entire screen. I only need it to fill the space around these two buttons. So I can go ahead and create a new component to say to the panel, hey, resize yourself so that you fit your children. And that component is what's called the content size fitter. And now that I select it, there's two options for how you're going to fit things horizontally and vertically. In our case, instead of unconstrained, which means it won't change at all, I'm going to change it to be preferred size. So it's going to move to where it prefers to be. And as you can see, it changes to be exactly the size of our buttons. And the same thing for the edges over here as well. Now we might want to have some spacing along this object as well, so that around the grid it doesn't look necessarily as stuck together. So to add that kind of border, we can make use of the padding property. And so by me going inside here and typing in a number, let's say 20, it adds 20 pixels to the left side, right side, top, and bottom, so we have some spacing. And so this will adjust appropriately based off of the screen that we're using. So if you want to see what it looks like in the game tab here, you'll see that it shows up and it looks pretty good for what we're doing. And so from here, we can also make use of the pivot. And just to show you what the pivot does, it sets where we modify objects. What position do we rotate or modify our image from? So if I change this pivot to a 0.25, notice that this is now positioned accordingly over on the bottom side of our screen here. And so now if we go ahead and play the game, you should notice that when we highlight the mouse or we click, it modifies the color. It currently doesn't do anything, but it's there and it's functional, but we can customize what this actually does. In our case, we want the Start Game button to load our actual game and the Quit Game to exit our game as well. So to do this, we're going to need to take a look at the button component first. So notice with the Start Game button, there is this button component. And there is some information here on how this is going to be drawn, but there's also this onclick section. And it's basically a list of things that we want to have execute from objects in our hierarchy. And we can call any public function inside of scripts that we've created through this onclick section. It's an easy way for people to be able to modify different parameters. So we're going to create a script to use for this. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the My Game folder, go to scripts, and create a new C# script. And I'm going to go ahead and call this main menu events. And so let's go ahead and open it up in Visual Studio, and we'll go ahead and reload just like normal. And for this script, we want to create some functions that will be public, that will do the things that we want these buttons to do. So to get started with, I'm going to go ahead and bring in some functions for us to work with. So I'm going to replace the start and the update functions here. And we don't need the using statements there. We just need Unity Engine. And we need to add one more using statement because we're going to be changing our level. So I need to place using Unity Engine .scene management because that's the namespace that the Scene Manager class is from. And I put a comment here to remind me of what that is. So the first thing we want to do is to create the quit game function. So I'm going to say public void quit game. And it's going to take in nothing, going to return nothing. And all I need to do is say application dot quit. And that'll quit the game if we've exported it out. Now likewise, to go to the game itself, we're going to have a public void, and I'm going to call it load level. And this is going to take in a string, which I'm going to call the level name. And to load a level, we need to call scene manager dot and then load scene. And this takes in a string, which will pass in the parameter for this particular function. So I need to type in level name here, and this will load that scene as long as it's been put into the build settings for this particular project. So with this, we're going to go ahead and save the script, and I'm going to dive back into the Unity editor. Now we need to attach the script to an object to be able to use it with these buttons. So to make it easy for us to see this, I'm going to go ahead and create an empty game object and give it a name of main menu events. And I'm going to reset the position so that it's all set for us. Alright, so now main menu events is attached. And so now in the menu, the button component, I can go ahead and hit plus. And you'll see there's that mini section. I'm going to drag and drop the main menu events object there. And now you'll see that all the components attached to this object have a menu. And I can go ahead and select quit game, and that'll work for us for this quit event. And so I'll select it, and now I can go to the start game button, and it will run this code as well. So I'm going to go ahead and add plus again, drag and drop the main menu events, and now I'm going to go ahead and select to call the load level function. And now, because there's a parameter there, I can type in the name of our game level. So you can type in whatever your game's level is. In my case, I have a bunch of different levels for us to work with. I'm going to go ahead and use the FPS test bed because that's something that we're already well familiar with. So inside here, I'm going to go ahead and paste that name. Note it needs to be exactly the same. One of the things that's important to note is that these levels need to be included in the build settings for your project for the scene manager to be able to have access to them. And we can modify this by going to the build settings menu, which we can get to by going to file and then selecting build settings. Now, by default, UFPS fills this with a number of levels for us, and you can check to include them or not. But in our case, we want to go ahead and add that testbed level that we had earlier. And you can also remove these if you want, click and drag them, remove them, etc., etc. I'm going to go ahead and remove everything because we're not using it. And I'm going to go ahead and add this level as well as the test bed itself. And so these are all the scenes that are going to be included with the game when we build it. And so there's a couple ways that we can do this. I want to save this scene. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my game scenes. I'm going to name this main menu. It exists. So I can go ahead and hit add open scenes, and that will add me to the front of the list. Notice on the right side there's a number. That is 0. That's the first thing that gets created. And I place the test bed here as well. And you can click and drag to arrange the position, but it's important to note that 0 is the first level that starts when the game plays after we export it. So again, we can click and drag around if we want, but again, main menu is where we want it to be for index 0. So instead of using the test bed, I've decided to create a new FPS example level, which uses material from the Building an Adventure Game Unity course, but I've gone ahead and made the level static, I've baked navigation, I've placed some zombies to make it a little more interesting, and if you play the game, you'll see that it works pretty well. It's got weapons, all that fun stuff. So now that we have this testbed level, or this FPS example level, I'm going to go ahead and save that, and we're going to go into the main menu. And so we're going to go ahead and select the Start Game button and change the button to instead use this example level that I've created. And again, you could use any level that you've already created. But now I'm going to go ahead and bring in the example in the scenes and build. And so now when we play the game, once we hit the Start Game button, it should pop us in. And perfect, we now have a main menu that works correctly for what we're trying to do in the game. Now it's important to point out that if you play the game and hit the quit game button, nothing is going to happen in this way. But that's okay though, because application.quit is only a function that works on the exported version of the game. If you want to see that this function is actually being called inside the editor, we can go a debug.log. We can print out quit game in the console, and when we hit the quit game button, you should see click, and you can see in the console quit game does occur. So we know this is being called, and if we export the game, we'll see that it exits out the correct way. So with that, we have a main menu, and we've got an understanding of some basic concepts of working with Unity's AOI system.